The wind on the high plains was a merciless thing, a sculptor of sand and sorrow. It scoured the life from the land, leaving behind little more than dust and the skeletons of forgotten ambitions. For Elara Vance, it felt like a personal judgment. It clawed at the thin fabric of her shawl, a constant, rasping reminder of how little stood between her and utter desolation. The town of Redemption, nestled in the valley below, had cast her out as surely as a body casts out a splinter. Her father, the town doctor, had died not in honor but in a laudanum-soaked disgrace, and his shame had clung to her like a shroud. She was a ghost in the making, her footsteps leaving no impression on the memory of a town that had already willed her into non-existence. Now, with the last of her father's meager savings spent and the boarding-house door closed to her, she had walked the 3 miles out to the Blackwood Ranch, the one place in the county more haunted than she was. Silas Blackwood was a fortress of a man, built of silence and grim resolve. His land was vast, his cattle numbered in the hundreds, but his house sat upon its acreage like a tombstone. Since the day he had returned from the cattle wars 5 years prior, a single rider where 3 had gone out, he had spoken little and smiled not at all. He had refused every offer of a wife, from the banker's prim daughter to the prettiest girl from the mercantile. The town whispered that he was cursed, that the ghosts of the men he'd killed, specifically Jedediah Thorne, trailed him like shadows. They said his soul was as barren as the alkali flats to the east. Elara knew better. She had seen him in town, his eyes not empty but full, brimming with a grief so profound it left no room for anything else. He wasn't barren, he was occupied territory. And she, who had nothing left to lose, understood the grim logic of necessity. She found him by the corral, his back to her as he mended a split rail with methodical, powerful movements. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting his formidable shadow long and dark across the parched earth. He was a man who seemed carved from the very rock and hardship of the landscape. For a long moment, she simply watched, gathering the tattered remnants of her courage. The wind tore a strand of hair from her bun and whipped it across her face. He didn't startle when she finally spoke, her voice thin but clear against the ceaseless wind. He simply stopped his work, his hands resting on the raw wood, and slowly turned. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no surprise, only a deep, weary caution. They swept over her, taking in the worn dress, the desperate set of her jaw, the tremor in her hands she could not still. He was a man who understood desperation. He saw it every day in the eyes of cornered animals. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her throat tight and dry. "I am Elara Vance." A flicker of recognition. He knew the name, the disgraced doctor's daughter. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He offered no pleasantries, no invitation to speak further. He simply waited, his stillness a challenge. This was the moment. The words she had rehearsed on the long, dusty walk out to his property felt foolish and brittle now, but they were all she had. She took a steadying breath, the air tasting of dust and the coming night. "The town talks," she said, her gaze unwavering. "They send their daughters to you with pies and stitched samplers, hoping to claim this land and gentle the man who holds it. They do not understand what a man like you requires." His expression did not change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He remained silent, forcing her to lay her entire, desperate hand bare. "You have no need for a blushing bride who will fill your house with lace and fragile hopes," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from the sheer audacity of her purpose. "You live with ghosts. You watch the horizon not for rain, but for trouble. You do not need a wife to share your bed." She paused, letting the harsh truth of it settle between them in the dying light. She saw the flash of anger in his eyes, but also something else, a weary, bitter acknowledgement. She had seen him correctly. She pressed on before he could dismiss her. "You need something else entirely." She took a single step forward, closing the distance until she was no longer a supplicant but a party to a negotiation. The wind howled, pressing her dress against her thin frame, but she stood her ground. She looked directly into his storm-gray eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and expected more of it. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, the words sharp and precise, honed by a final, desperate clarity. "You do not need a wife. You need a witness." His stillness became absolute. The hammer he held hung forgotten in his hand. The phrase, so strange and unexpected, landed in the silence between them with the weight of a thrown stone. A wife was a partner in life. A witness was a partner in trouble. A wife offered comfort. A witness offered corroboration. It was a proposal stripped of all sentiment, a contract for survival. He saw not a frightened girl before him, but a reflection of his own stark reality. A woman who understood that in this land, survival was the only real vow one could make. He studied her face, the faint smudges of dust on her cheeks, the fierce, hunted intelligence in her eyes. She was not offering him love or affection or any of the soft things he had long since buried. She was offering him a presence, an alibi, a second pair of eyes to watch the long, empty horizon. She was offering to stand with him, not in a church, but on a precipice. The wind died for a moment, and in the sudden, ringing silence, he finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. "Because," Elara answered, the truth raw and unvarnished. "I have nowhere else to be, and because a ghost has no one to speak for her either. It seems to me we have a similar need." He held her gaze for another long minute, a silent weighing of risks and necessities. Then he turned back to the fence, picked up a nail and set it against the wood. With 2 sharp, definitive strikes of the hammer, he drove it home. He did not look at her again. "The house is unlocked," he said to the rail. "There is food in the larder. The room at the top of the stairs is yours." It was not an acceptance. It was an acquiescence. A key turned in a lock no one else had dared to touch. As Elara walked toward the dark, silent house that was to be her new home, she did not feel joy or relief, but the cold, heavy certainty of a pact made in the shadow of a shared doom. She was no longer Elara Vance, the doctor's forgotten daughter. She was Silas Blackwood's witness. And she knew, with a chilling premonition, that the day would come when she would be called upon to testify. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of shared silence. Silas rose before the sun, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm Elara needed. He would be gone for hours, a solitary figure moving against the vast, indifferent landscape, checking fences, tending to his herd, his rifle always resting in the scabbard on his saddle. He was a man in constant, quiet motion, as if stillness might allow his ghosts to catch him. Elara, in turn, brought a semblance of order to the house. It was a place steeped in neglect, thick with the dust of grief. She scrubbed floors, mended curtains, and aired out rooms that had been shuttered for years. She found a woman's touch in forgotten things, a faded blue ribbon tucked in a drawer, a small book of poetry with a pressed wildflower inside. These remnants of a past life, she treated with a gentle reverence, cleaning around them, leaving them as quiet memorials to the woman Silas had lost. She never asked about her. Their arrangement was not built on such intimacies. Their conversations were sparse, utilitarian exchanges about supplies, weather, or the health of a newborn calf. Yet, in the spaces between these clipped sentences, a different language began to form. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh water for her on the porch every morning, saving her the trip to the well. It was in the way she took to mending his work shirts, her stitches small and neat, reinforcing the worn fabric at the elbows and collar. One evening, she found a freshly picked bundle of wild prairie sage on the kitchen table, its clean, sharp scent cutting through the stale air of the house. She said nothing, but placed it in a jar of water where it could perfume the room. He said nothing, but she noticed he looked at it once before turning to the fire. These were not gestures of affection, but of acknowledgement. They were 2 solitary creatures learning the patterns of a shared orbit, building a fragile trust not with words, but with deeds. She was a witness not just to his potential future troubles, but to his present, guarded existence. She witnessed the nights he couldn't sleep. She would lie awake in her small room, listening to the floorboards creak below as he paced like a caged animal. Sometimes, a muffled cry would escape him, a name torn from a nightmare. Anna. On those nights, Elara would rise and quietly rebuild the fire in the main hearth, leaving a pot of chamomile tea warming on the hob. She would return to her room without a sound. In the morning, the pot would be empty, the fire a bed of glowing embers. He never mentioned it, and she never intruded. She simply bore witness to his pain and offered a small, anonymous comfort against the dark. In turn, he began to see her. He noticed the way she moved with a quiet efficiency, the intelligence in her eyes when she read from the handful of books she'd brought with her. He saw the strength in her slender frame, a resilience that matched the hard country they lived in. She was not fragile. She was like the wiregrass that bent in the wind but whose roots held the earth together. The threat, when it came, did not arrive like a thunderclap but like a slow, creeping chill. It started with small things. A section of fence cut in the night, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off. A dead coyote left near their well, a clear and ugly warning. Silas's posture grew even more rigid, his eyes constantly scanning the low hills that bordered his property to the north, Thorn Land. He began cleaning his rifle on the porch every evening, the metallic clicks of the action a stark punctuation to the chirping of the crickets. He never spoke of the thorns, but Elara knew. The town's whispers had told her enough. Jedediah Thorn had died by Silas's gun in a dispute over a spring, and his two brothers, Caleb and Malachi, were not men to let a grudge die of old age. One afternoon, Silas rode in early, his face set like granite. He dismounted, not bothering to tend to his horse immediately. He walked straight to the porch where Elara was shelling beans. "The north spring is fouled," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Deliberate. Elara stopped her work, the dry rattle of the beans in the metal bowl ceasing. This was an escalation. Poisoning a water source was not just a threat. It was a declaration of war. She looked at his hands, balled into tight fists at his sides. She saw the tremor of rage he fought to control. "What will you do?" she asked softly. He stared out at the Thorn Lands, his jaw working. "What they expect me to do. Ride over there, full of righteous anger. Is what Jedediah did. It's a trap." He understood their minds, their tactics. He would not be baited into a fight on their terms, in their territory. He was a patient man, a survivor. He turned his gaze from the horizon and looked at her, truly looked at her. His stormy eyes were clear, holding a grim purpose. "I'm riding into town for supplies," he said. "Barricade the door after I leave. Use the shotgun if you have to." He paused, his gaze intense. "It's not loaded." He walked past her into the house and returned a moment later with a small, heavy box of shells. He placed it on the table beside her. "Now it can be." He was not just giving her a weapon. He was giving her a choice and a terrible responsibility. He was trusting her not only with his home but with her own life. This was a new article in their unspoken contract. The quiet witness was being asked to become a guardian. As she watched him saddle a fresh horse and ride away, the shotgun resting heavy across her lap, Elara understood that the slow, quiet days were over. The ghosts of Silas Blackwood's past were no longer content to haunt his nights. They were coming, and they were coming for everything. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of a distant rain and the cold, metallic taste of fear. The storm broke just after dusk, a furious assault of wind and rain that turned the world outside the windows into a black, churning chaos. It was the perfect cover. Elara had barred the heavy oak door and shuttered the windows as Silas had instructed. The house now a small, defiant island in a sea of tempest and gathering menace. The shotgun lay across the kitchen table, its twin barrels glinting in the flickering lamplight. She had loaded it with methodical care, the solid, heavy weight of the brass shells a terrifying comfort in her hands. Every gust of wind that rattled the walls sounded like a footstep. Every branch that scraped against the roof sounded like a hand searching for a way in. She was not a brave woman by nature, The fear was a cold, living thing inside her, but it was overshadowed by a grim, unfamiliar resolve. This small house, with its silent, grieving owner, was the only sanctuary she had left in the world. She would not let it be taken. An hour passed, then two. The storm raged, a relentless symphony of nature's fury. Alara sat at the table, her back to the wall, watching the front door. She thought of Silas, riding through this tempest, and a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. The trip to town and back was long, and this storm made it treacherous. The thought that the thorns might intercept him on the road, away from the defensible position of the ranch, was a chilling one. Was that their plan? To lure him away and leave her, the lone witness, to be dealt with separately? The house groaned under the assault of the wind, and in a momentary lull, she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the storm. The distinct, splintering crack of wood from the back of the house. The kitchen door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They hadn't waited for Silas. They had come for her. She grabbed the shotgun, its stock smooth and cold against her cheek, and moved silently from the kitchen into the main room, pressing herself into the deep shadows beside the stone fireplace. The back door gave way with a final, groaning crash, and the wind and rain surged into the house, extinguishing the lamp on the kitchen table and plunging the ground floor into near-total darkness, broken only by the faint, rhythmic glow of the embers in the hearth. Two figures, silhouetted against the tumultuous blackness of the doorway, stepped inside. They were large men, draped in wet oilskins, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hats. "Just the girl is here," one of them growled, his voice a low rasp. "Caleb, check the upstairs. Malachi, you search down here. Blackwood must have a safe." "What about her?" the other, presumably Caleb, asked. "She'll make less trouble when we're done," Malachi grunted. "A fire. Looks like a tragic accident. A lonely woman. A tipped lamp. A house that goes up like tinder in this wind." The cold, casual cruelty of it stole Alara's breath. They were not just here to rob or to intimidate. They were here to erase, to eliminate the witness Silas had so recently acquired. As Malachi fumbled to light a lantern, Caleb started toward the stairs. This was it. There would be no negotiation, no appeal to mercy. Her life was being measured in the seconds it took for a match to strike. In that fleeting moment, she saw not the frightened orphan cast out by the town, but the woman who had stood before Silas Blackwood and made a bargain for survival. Her fear solidified into a hard, sharp edge. She would honor her end of it. As Caleb's boot hit the first step, Alara acted. She did not aim to kill, but to create chaos. She raised the shotgun, aimed high toward the far wall above their heads, and pulled one of the triggers. The roar was deafening in the enclosed space, a physical blow that shook the very timbers of the house. Plaster and splinters rained down from the wall. Both men yelled in shock, spinning around, momentarily blinded by the muzzle flash. Malachi dropped his unlit lantern with a clatter. It was the opening she needed. She darted from the shadows of the fireplace, not toward the front door as they might have expected, but toward the stairs. She ran past the stunned Caleb, her shoulder bumping his, and scrambled up the steps into the pitch-black upper floor she knew so well. "She's upstairs," Caleb roared, his shock turning to fury. "Get her!" Alara didn't stop in her room. She ran to the end of the hall to Silas's room. She knew what she was looking for. She fumbled in the dark, her hands sweeping across the rough wooden floor beneath his bed. Her fingers brushed against a cold, metal ring. A trapdoor. She had discovered it weeks ago while sweeping. With a grunt of effort, she pulled it open. It led not to a cellar, but to a narrow crawlspace within the walls, a hiding spot. But she wasn't going to hide. As she heard their heavy boots thundering up the stairs, she grabbed the heavy wool blanket from Silas's bed. She retreated to the far end of the hall, near the window overlooking the porch roof. She heard them burst onto the landing, cursing in the darkness. She took a deep breath and then screamed, a raw, terrified sound she didn't have to feign. "Get away from me!" she shrieked, then hurled the bundled blanket out the open window. It landed on the porch roof below with a heavy, satisfying thud. She jumped, Malachi yelled. It was the oldest trick in the world, but in the dark and the storm and their own bloodlust, they fell for it. They rushed to the window, peering out into the sheeting rain, trying to see where she had gone. As they crowded together, their backs to her, Ilara moved. She slipped through the open trapdoor into Silas's room and, with all her strength, slammed it shut from below, sliding the heavy iron bolt she had also found into place. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy time. The sound of their enraged shouts and the splintering of wood as they realized their mistake was muffled by the floorboards. She had trapped them. She was alone, in the dark, with two violent men locked in the room above her head. She scrambled back to the main room, grabbing the fallen lantern and the matches. Her hands shook violently, but she managed to get it lit. Holding the light aloft, she reloaded the spent barrel of the shotgun. Now all she could do was wait. Wait for them to break through the floor, or wait for Silas to come home. She stood in the center of the room, the lantern in one hand, the gun in the other, a lone sentinel in a house under siege. She was no longer just a witness. She was a combatant. The sound of splintering wood from above was a frantic, rhythmic drumming that seemed to count down the final seconds of Ilara's life. The thorns were tearing apart the floorboards of Silas's room with their bare hands and a fireplace poker, their furious, muffled curses a testament to their rage. Ilara stood by the front door, the shotgun's cold stock pressed against her shoulder, her knuckles white where she gripped the weapon. The rain had lessened to a steady, hissing downpour, and through it, she listened for the one sound that meant either salvation or final doom, the sound of a horse. Minutes stretched into an eternity. A floorboard overhead gave way with a loud crack, followed by a triumphant roar from Malachi. They would be through soon. Her heart beat a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but a strange, cold calm had settled over her. She had made her stand. She had done more than she ever thought she could. And then she heard it, faintly at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable, desperate thunder of hooves, splashing through the mud-soaked yard at a full gallop. Silas. He hadn't been caught on the road. He was coming home. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. But it was immediately followed by a new, sharp spike of fear. He was riding into a trap. The thorns would hear him. They would be ready. As Silas burst from the curtain of rain into the faint light spilling from the doorway, a dark, avenging figure on a lathered horse, a section of the ceiling above Ilara gave way. Malachi Thorne dropped through the hole, landing in a crouch not 10 feet from her. He was a bear of a man, his face a mask of fury, the iron poker gripped in his hand like a club. He lunged. At the same moment, Silas vaulted from his still-moving horse, his rifle already in his hands. Time seemed to slow. Ilara saw Malachi's arm swing, the poker arcing toward her head. She saw Silas, framed in the doorway, bringing his rifle to bear. But there was no time. Malachi was too close. Without conscious thought, Ilara sidestepped and pulled the second trigger. The shotgun bucked hard against her shoulder, the blast echoing the first. The heavy load of buckshot caught Malachi in the leg and side. Not a killing shot at that range, but a devastating one. He howled, staggering backward, dropping the poker with a clang as he crashed into the wall. Upstairs, Caleb roared in fury at the sound of the shot and his brother's cry. He appeared in the jagged hole in the ceiling, a pistol in his hand, aiming down at Silas. But Silas was no longer in the doorway. He had moved with a predator's instinct, rolling to the side. He came up on one knee inside the room, his rifle finding its target. The two shots were almost simultaneous. The boom of Silas's rifle and the crack of Caleb's pistol. A splinter of wood flew from the doorframe near Ilara's head. Caleb, however, made no sound. He simply folded, collapsing back onto the upper floor with a heavy, final thud. Silence descended, thick and sudden, broken only by Malachi's pained groans and the steady hiss of the rain outside. Silas rose slowly, his rifle still held at the ready. His eyes, flinty and hard, swept the room, checking every shadow before finally settling on Alara. She stood frozen, the shotgun still raised, its barrel smoking faintly. Her hair had fallen from its pins, her face was smudged with plaster dust, and her eyes were wide with shock and the adrenaline of the fight. He saw the splintered wood by her head, the downed man at her feet, and the gaping hole in his ceiling. He saw that she hadn't hidden. She had fought. His gaze moved from the scene of violence to her face, and for the first time since she had met him, the hard, protective shell around him seemed to crack. The ghosts in his eyes receded, replaced by a raw, staggering astonishment. He took a step toward her, his boots crunching on the debris. He stopped a few feet away, the space between them charged with the aftermath of shared violence. He said nothing, but his eyes held the question. "I bolted them in your room," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "They came through the ceiling." His gaze flickered upward to the hole, then back to her. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his rifle. He walked past her to the groaning Malachi Thorn, disarmed him, and bound his hands with a length of rope from his saddlebag. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. When he was done, he straightened and finally turned to face her fully. He reached out not to touch her, but to take the heavy shotgun from her hands. She let it go, her fingers uncurling from the stock. The weapon had grown impossibly heavy. He leaned it against the wall and then stood before her, his large frame blocking out the wrecked room behind him. He looked at her, his storm-gray eyes holding a new light, a complex mixture of gratitude, respect, and a dawning, unfamiliar tenderness. The silence stretched, but it was no longer the empty, cautious silence of strangers. It was a silence filled with the deafening roar of everything they had just endured together. "You are a witness," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. He corrected himself.
No.
"You are more than that." He took another step, closing the final distance between them. He gently brushed a smudge of dust from her cheek with his thumb, his touch startlingly gentle for a man of such hardship. It was the first time they had ever touched. In that simple, profound contact, the unspoken contract between them was irrevocably rewritten. She was not just a witness to his troubles, nor he to her survival. They were partners, forged not by vows in a church, but here, in the crucible of violence and fear, in a wrecked house on a wind-scoured plain. The ghosts were still there, his and hers, but for the first time, they were not alone with them. Looking into his eyes, Alara Vance, the forgotten girl, knew she had finally found a place to stand. And Silas Blackwood, the haunted cowboy, knew he had finally found a reason to defend it. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air clean and cold, and in the quiet aftermath, something new and resilient had begun to take root.